everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today, PhD candidate Jack Bull joins me for the first time. Welcome to History Valley, Jack.
Thank you.
Jack got his undergrad at St. Mary's University in 2016, which was followed by a master's degree in 2018 in King's College. And he is currently a PhD candidate studying under Professor Marcus Vincent. And I recently published 2 interviews with Professor Vincent. The first time I spoke to him, we talked about Marcion priority, his work on that, and Marcion and the envy dating of the Synoptic Gospels, which was followed by a show with him and James Valiant on Roman provenance specifically. Now, today we're going to be talking about Ignatius of Antioch. He is someone that supposedly wrote some letters in the first decade or 2 decades of the early 2nd century AD. So, Jack, tell us, what are the mainstream views regarding Ignatius for those that are not familiar?
Yeah. So Ignatius of Antioch is one of those characters that often gets missed out, I feel, when we're talking about New Testament study and early Christian literature. He is presumed to have written some letters, but how many and how long these letters are is greatly up for debate. In 1495, we get our first printed glimpse into the Ignatian epistles, and there's 3 that are published by Ignatius, one to John, the beloved disciple, and then a follow-up one later, of which he presumably gets no reply, and then one to the Virgin Mary, but he does get a reply from her. And it was very quickly established in Ignatian literature that these ones were spurious, much later, and had nothing to do with the true Ignatius, whoever that might have been in the 2nd century. But then, 3 years after those, we get published what is initially assumed to be genuine epistles. So there are 11 of these, and they come in what later becomes known as the Long Recension. And we'll talk a bit more about recensions and letter collections as we go. But the fundamental theme of all Ignatian literature is trying to work out how many letter collections there are, how many letters are in those collections, and the recensions, i.e., how long those differing letters are. So after these 11 are published in 1498, we get 2 more in 1536, including the previous 11, but ignoring the 3 we spoke about originally to John and to the Virgin Mary. And these again are considered mostly genuine. There's no real scholarly work being done on the authenticity of these letters. Rather, they're just being circulated and promulgated under the name of Ignatius. But a little bit later, in 1623, a man called Fidelius takes up this question and publishes 12 epistles. But he works out that 7 of these are genuine and still in what we call the Long Recension. And this, again, is widely accepted for a short amount of time until we get the monumental figure of James Ussher. And Ussher has the great privilege of making the discovery of the 12 letters formerly published by Fidelius and others, but this time in what we call the Middle Recension, or at the time it just becomes known as the Shorter Recension, because they're just shorter versions of the epistles that were published previously. And he says that of these 12, again, 7 are genuine, and these 7 genuine ones, he agrees with Fidelius about which ones are genuine, but again in their shorter form. At this point, we only know the letters in Latin until Isaac Voss comes in 1646 and publishes the Greek version, again in the Middle or Shorter Recension as it was then known. And then at that point, the conversation splits into 2 camps. They're either rejected outright by mostly Protestant scholars who seek to distance themselves from the Eucharistic theology and threefold ecclesiastical hierarchy that Ignatius very clearly displays in those 7 letters, or they're accepted by Anglican scholars and Catholic scholars who do seek to hold on to some of those elements. 200 years later, almost 350 years after the original printing of those Ignatian letters that were considered false, Cureton has the great privilege of finding 3 letters in yet a shorter version than the middle recension or longer recension that we have before. The great Syriac scholar then argues that these three letters, one to Polycarp, one to the Ephesians, and one to the Romans, in their very short form when compared to the other letter collections, are the genuine ones. And originally, this gets quite a lot of backing. J.B. Lightfoot, the amazing monumental figure in patristic scholarship, backs him initially and says that these three letters in their Syriac form, so neither in Latin nor Greek, but only in Syriac, even to this day have been found in that recension, are genuine, but quickly reverses his mind. And based on the work of Theodor Zahn, the great German scholar, he builds further on top of that and seeks to disprove and kill off Cureton's concept, Cureton's idea. And from that moment on, from 1885, he is forgotten. And for the last 200 years, Ignatian scholarship has rather stagnated, much like other parts of biblical and apostolic fathers' scholarship. Until the mid 80s, and early 90s, when some scholars like Joly and Hubner and Lechner and my supervisor Vincent start to wonder again about the authenticity and legitimacy of these seven letters. And they begin to reject this seven letter collection, but still ignoring the three letter collection in the short recension. It's only in 2019 that in his book Rewriting Early Christianity that Vincent rediscovers Cureton's letters properly and begins to unpack what they are saying in the last chapter of his book. Unfortunately, though, because of the brevity of his last chapter, he could not truly work out all of the puzzles in this extremely complex question, trying to draw in all the different elements of these epistles in every letter collection and recension. And so he left it to me to unpick this work. But we are very much still in a world where the scholarly consensus is that Ignatius wrote 7 letters to Polycarp, the Ephesians, the Romans, Magnesians, Smyrnaeans, Trallians, and Philippians. In the middle recension, these are accepted. In the Greek, and in the longer recensions and other letter collections, they are rejected. And so Marcus and I predominantly really want to bring the question back to light, not necessarily even creating all the answers straight at once, but certainly challenging our New Testament colleagues and our patristic colleagues to not be so complacent in the way in which they use the Ignatian letters. Sorry, Jacob, I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. What led you to question the scholarly consensus regarding Ignatius?
Yeah, so in his book, Marcus outlines some of the issues, and it's interesting because in his previous videos with yourself, he talks about some of the problems with the Pauline letters in relation to Marcion, and how he questions in that case how we can move from the slightly shorter Marcion Pauline letters to the current canon we have today. And he applies a similar question to Ignatius in his book. He says, well, why is it that the resurrection goes missing in the three letter collection if that's the older one? Why is it the case that a monk at the end of the 2nd century, which is what proponents of the 7 letter collection say happened, why is it that the 7 letter collection was inherited by a later monk, probably a proto-Catholic of some form, and he removed the resurrection? Why did he remove the name of Jesus? Why did he remove sort of more orthodox theology around the Trinity? And so this initially begun my interest in the question. And it was quite a scary thing for me at the time because Ignatius was one of the reasons that I chose to become a Catholic. And so when Marcus was telling me these things in my master's lesson as a master's student, I was worried and panicked. And actually, if I'm honest, slightly angry with him. And he could see it all over my face. And so he pointed me towards his book and he very kindly sent me the proofs of it before it was published. And after reading almost 100 some odd words of these minutiae that were removed, I began to agree with him almost immediately and start my own work. One of the most critical and thorough points I think Marcus uses in his scholarship is the linguistical and um, the grammar elements he studies in depth in the epistles of Paul, and does it in brief to Ignatius between the seven-letter collection of the middle recension and the three-letter collection of the short recension. And he looks for words that begin with alpha, and he looks at them where they appear in the seven-letter collection and where they appear in the three-letter collection. And he realizes that many of these words that we would take for granted, like truth or love or the name Jesus, like we said, are removed. And we can easily imagine that for those who wanted to make a theological point, they could remove theologies quite easily. I give you an example. The seven-letter collection is full of information about the threefold ecclesial hierarchy of the church. Ignatius is clear in the middle recension of the seven letters that the church is made up of bishops who are ultimately in charge and run their diocese, but more probably parishes or a couple of churches. And then under them, there are the presbyteroi, who sort of oversee different things. He's not entirely clear about what they do. And then under them is the diaconoi, the least of these three. And in the seven-letter collection, these three figures are the absolute authority of the church, and they are crucial to the working of it. Now, jump to the three-letter collection. These things are almost absent entirely, apart from in Ignatius to Polycarp 6, which we come on to later. And I can see how those things were removed. If I was at the end of the 2nd century and I didn't want that form of hierarchy in the church, I could see easily how I could cherry pick those things out and move them. But yet, when it comes to things like grammatical style and the lexicon that the author is using, these are the sort of things that it's much more difficult for an interpolator or a redactor to remove. And so in my own study, one of the ones that struck me immediately was the removal of two small improper prepositions, horis and ama. These are two really small words, part of a Greek language that are stylistic choices, let's say. And Brown, in his 1969 book, The Authentic Writings of Ignatius, which is a deep study of the grammar and lexicon of Ignatius, says that these two words are characteristic of all of the Ignatian epistles. They are the defining improper prepositions for him. And yet in the three-letter collection, they are missing. And my question is then, well, why? Who has gone to that length to seek out individual words that have no theological meaning, no importance whatsoever for the theology of a text or the meaning of a text? And there are hundreds of these examples, which Marcus and I have both seen. He only did A, but I've tried to do the entire of the three-letter collection, which has been some work. But they just keep cropping up. And so the question is, of this small example, who is that thorough? Who is able to redact in such a manner with such surgical precision? And my answer is no one. I do not think that's possible. And so that's just one of the small elements of why I think Ignatius is almost certainly moving from the three letters to the seven rather than their reverse.
How many of the letters attributed to Ignatius were actually written by him?
Yeah. And that's a really important question, right? Because
Mhm.
in the same with the Pauline ones, the authenticity of a text, especially for early Christians, you'd hope would be predicated on the author being someone of importance, someone especially that you could hopefully trace back to the apostles, right? Because if it's just written by Dave down the road, then what he's saying is neither here nor there. Ultimately, I fear greatly, just as I think Marcus does with the Pauline epistles, that we might never really know about who wrote them and how many were written by them. But I do think that we can make some guesses as to their dating, and therefore, hopefully, work out a bit about maybe the character who wrote them. If we then jump to the traditional story of Ignatius, we might be able to work out something here. Eusebius says that Ignatius dies in 108. This is traditionally rejected by most scholars, with Purvo dating it to about 135 to 140 and Timothy Barnes dating it into the 140s. In which case, if this is true, then the other two scholars are not Eusebius are right, then none of the letters can be written by this Ignatius figure that Eusebius knows,
Hmm.
because this is far after his death, and as you use your famous phrase, unless he's time traveled, which seems unlikely, that they're not by him. So then we must ask the question: we need to date the epistles first. Let's see when they were written, and I think that the seven letter collection undoubtedly shows signs of being a late second century text. Second century texts. They show elements of knowing Noetus of Smyrna. They show elements of this return to uh, uh, um, associating with the Jews. In the three-letter collection, we're missing these things. In the later letter collections, we see signs of the resurrection. In the three-letter collections, we don't. In the later ones, we see evidence of Jesus being more closely associated as an equal with God and Jesus actually being God. Whereas in the early letters, it gets a bit more muddled. There isn't really such a clear theology about what's happening. The most important one, perhaps for Catholics like myself, is that in the seven letters, there is a deep, rich Eucharistic theology of a literal transubstantiation esque thing going on. But yet, to go back to the three letters, we've got an issue again. Although the Eucharist is mentioned, it's far more hazy. So we can therefore say that the three-letter collection is probably older than the seven. And I think we could also date it probably before Marcion. And the reason for me saying that is because there seems to be no hint of these extra questions that later theologians and systematic organizers of church are bringing up. There's no questions around the Jews per se. Ignatius seems to be completely oblivious to that, although he doesn't mention them. He doesn't even really seem to know about them. He doesn't really seem to know about the Pauline epistles, except maybe 1 Corinthians. And if Marcus is right, as I think he is, that the Pauline epistles are properly systematized and the New Testament is created first under Marcion, then it would make sense that Ignatius doesn't know them in such a way, or at least doesn't value them. He also doesn't know the Gospels, neither Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John in the three letters. In the seven letter collections, he knows Matthew and John very well. And so, if this is the case and he is pre Marcion, then we're getting close to the question now. So we can say, well, maybe he's pre 130s, 140s. In which case, I would argue that there is a good chance that someone called Ignatius towards the beginning of the second century, wrote these letters. I think particularly for two reasons. Number one, in Ignatius to the letters to the Romans, and I highly recommend that any of your viewers who haven't read the Ignatian letters before go away and read that one first, because this is by far the most insightful into the psyche of the author of these letters. Ignatius to the Romans in the three-letter collection bears no theology, almost. It doesn't say anything in particular about Jesus or God or the Jews or the Old Testament, the New Testament. It literally says nothing. Ignatius purely writes this letter from the heart, begging the Romans, not the Roman Christians, that is, not to intervene on his behalf to be killed. Ignatius is traveling, having been arrested, according to the myth, and maybe we'll come back to that, from the east to Rome to be martyred, to be fed to lions, as the traditional story says. And he's scared, clearly, that the Roman Church is going to intervene on his behalf and stop that from happening. So he writes his letter imploring them, do not hinder me. I will become the bread of God. I want to suffer like Jesus Christ. He's desperate to be killed. And so I believe that this letter is so personal and so emotive that the purpose of a later forger seems to me unrealistic and rather futile. The only, as Professor Alan Brent suggested to me, the only other motive would be to further the martyrology of and the narrative of Ignatius' death and further sort of his cult. But I think that one of the issues with that is you would do what the Seven Letter Collection did, which is insert theology in and amongst it as well to justify your own position, which doesn't happen. This is truly a personal endeavor. And so that's one of the reasons why I think Ignatius probably wrote that one. We find a similar thing in Polycarp. Polycarp is also mentions Ignatius, that he had correspondence with him, or at least that he'd met him, in chapter 13 of Polycarp to the Philippians. And some have claimed that this might be an interpolation, and I'm open to that idea. But Ignatius writes this letter to Polycarp, urging him to maintain unity, to not be scared of false teachers, to pray for all men, and all these beautiful exhortations about how we should run the church. And again, this seems to me to be a very personal correspondence between a bishop who's been at this for a while and a relatively new person. Bear me 1 second. Excuse me.
It's fine.
This relatively new bishop. And so again, the motive for a later interpolation to me seems rather bogus. Now, the only one that could be leveled at is Ephesians. Ephesians is the most redacted of the shorter seven letter collection into the three. We go from about 1,049 words down to 400 and something. So we're missing most of it in the three letter collection, if you believe it went that way. But Ephesians does have some theology in it, some things that may have been written later to prove a point, one way or the other. Oh, for goodness sake. So I think all in all, therefore, those letters were written by certainly a bishop. The question of whether it was Ignatius is more complex, and who this person was. In 2008, Roger Parvou wrote a book arguing that the author of the letters of Ignatius were followers of Apelles, the Entwistle follower of Marcion, who left him over disagreements about a great variety of things. And he argues that the writer was some form of Apellian. But he's only dealing again with the seven letter collection in his work. And so I've tried to bring that over to the three letter collection to see whether this would be the case. And yet again, I find that these letters show no signs of Marcionite or Apellian views at all. I do think, however, that the myth and the martyrology and the acts of martyrdom that spring up about Ignatius after his death are almost certainly spurious. And it raises a big problem about what we can and can't trust later on from people like Origen and Irenaeus and Eusebius about what they say about Ignatius. I think that the figure of Ignatius, although I say that the bishop was martyred, and I've called him Ignatius for sake of ease, may or may not, his name may or may not be Ignatius, we don't know. And Irenaeus is a good sign of that. Irenaeus does quote Ignatius, but he doesn't name him. He calls him the martyr and then proceeds to quote from Romans. And this raises the question, well, if Ignatius knew Polycarp, and Polycarp obviously was the teacher of Irenaeus, then why name him anonymously? This seems completely out of character and rather rogue. And so it does seem to me that Ignatius as a figure may have been a later name applied to him, to a martyr that was killed who was a bishop of some form. Maybe not Bishop of Antioch, maybe not even a bishop per se, but he was a leader perhaps. We can draw an insight, I think, from Lucian. Lucian of Samosata writes this satirical piece about a man called Peregrinus. Peregrinus, he says, was the leader of a synagogue, a prophet and a cult leader. And this figure closely matches Ignatius, except in the Lucian narrative, Peregrinus eventually leaves the church and becomes a philosopher and rejects Christianity completely. And so I think if we perhaps merge the two views, because I don't think Lucian can be trusted on all items of his description. He calls Ignatius the leader of a synagogue, which I think is nonsense. I think that's a complete mistake on Lucian's part. and not to mention he's a satirical writer, so he's clearly writing to undermine Ignatius, and therefore I don't believe his conclusion per se. But if we mesh these two things together, right, this Lucian concept that this martyr Peregrinus or whoever he was existed, and the Ignatian view of the epistles that martyr was called Ignatius and he was a bishop of Antioch, etc., then we might get to some answer that we are dealing with a leader of a church at the beginning of the 2nd century who, regardless of his ecclesial position, whether it be bishop or presbyter or deacon or whatever, is killed for the faith. Not necessarily in Rome, as this seems to be a completely nonsensical position, but was killed by the authorities for being a Christian. And then after that, the narrative begins to spring up around him, I think is the more sensible thing. So that's a very long way of answering your question, which is to say that Ignatius per se probably wrote none of them, but this mysterious martyred figure almost certainly did write 3 of them, I think, because of their personal nature, because of the way in which he wishes to convey his messages to those he knows, not just random spurious theologies that make no sense to anyone. And so, yeah, I hope that answers your question somewhat.
So when do you think Ignatius died?
Well, as I said, I don't think that we can trust Eusebius at all.
Mhm.
I think that Eusebius hasn't got a Scooby. He is purely basing his position off the acts of martyrdom of Ignatius. And I think this is a big problem because that is clearly a later text. I'd also hasten to mention that Ignatius' letter to the Romans has a completely separate transmission history. So we have all of these epistles in letter collections, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning, and it's
Mhm.
important to return to this because this is one of the fundamental questions, is that they're all in these little collections, but Romans takes this separate transmission history altogether and then reappears with letters later on. And Romans gets inserted into the Acts of Martyrdom of Ignatius. And I think that that is what Eusebius inherits and therefore thinks he can trust them because he trusts the letter as well, which we now know is a mistake, but I think that's the point where he got to. If therefore 108 is a mistake for Ignatius, 108 might not be a mistake for the figure who did write them. And that's one of the key distinctions, which is subtle, that I think is important to get across, is that just because it wasn't Ignatius that died in 108 doesn't mean that this martyr died in a time around then between 100 and 110. I think, a specific date would be pure conjecture. But we must say it's before Marcion. And therefore, I suppose if we were being extremely liberal, we might say anywhere from 100 to, let's say, 125. But we'd have to believe if Polycarp's mention of Ignatius is genuine, which again, like I said, I haven't quite decided about that yet. Vincent and Hubner and Lechner all reject Polycarp's mention of Ignatius. And if they're right, then obviously we cannot use him, and therefore we can keep it open. But I would say that if that is true, then we must bring it back ever so slightly to that 100, 125 area. But if Polycarp is not there, then you could open it slightly to just before Marcion, let's say 135, 140. And that becomes a bit more difficult to, then instead of dealing with a range of 25 years, we're looking at a range of 40 years.
So I take it that you also don't think that Agapius Hieropolis, his mentions of Ignatius, you don't think those are reliable either, considering Agapius is writing much later.
Yeah, I mean, we're almost 800 years after the event. And Agapius doesn't really, he seems to be basing it off Eusebius anyway, because he mentions that the bishop of Antioch was Peter, and then Evodius, and then Ignatius. But in other accounts, we're told that Ignatius is the second bishop. It's Peter, then Ignatius. And so it seems to me that Agapius is clearly just working off Eusebius's assumptions, which, again, as I've already shown, I think to be a bit difficult and a bit confused. And Eusebius is even more rogue in some sense of his knowledge of Ignatius, because he probably has, as I showed before, it works off a lot of the same stuff that Origen does. And what strikes me as strange is that when Origen talks of Ignatius, he only really knows the three letters of the three-letter collection: Polycarp, Ephesians, Romans. And when Eusebius gets them, he also quotes from those three, and then also quotes just ever so slightly from Ignatius to the Smyrnaeans, which is not included in the Syriac, three letters. And so, even though he knows what his predecessor knew, he clearly assumes, well, sorry, we could assume then as well that Origen had those 7 letters too, but maybe casted the other 4 off as being spurious. Because whatever Origen knew, we assume Eusebius had. But Eusebius doesn't go quite as far as that and still thinks that Smyrnaeans is worth quoting. And so, again, what Eusebius is up to and his motivations for understanding Ignatius are extremely peculiar to me. And I don't think he can be trusted entirely, even because he distrusts his predecessor's work on Ignatius.
In the paper, you suggested that S3LC became S7LC, not vice versa. What does this mean, and what are the implications of this scenario?
Yeah. So they're my abbreviations for the 3-letter collection and the shorter 7-letter collection, which is the widely accepted one today. Most of you will hear it as the middle recension, and this is a complete misnomer and horrific nomenclature that, as an academic community, we have accepted now for nigh on 200 years. There is no such thing with it of letter collections in Ignatius, as particularly of the 7-letter collection that is now accepted. When you buy any letter collection of Ignatian epistles, they will come as 7 letters in the middle recension, and they will give you no warning as to anything else about it. But the 7-letter collection in our manuscript evidence and in every edition that we have, early edition from the earliest publishers of the 12 and the 13-letter collections, there is no 7. The 7 is a pure work of fiction that was created out of the minds of scholars. Manuscripts we have either have 3, 9.5. The reason why it's a half is because the manuscript family seems to have been corrupted at some point, and others have copied from it. A 12, a 13, a 15, and a 17-letter collection. They're the only letter collections we have. At no point do we get a 7 until scholars have worked out that that's what they think is genuine. And so when I talk of the 7-letter collection, which is accepted, it's important to have that in the back of our minds, that that's purely a work of academic nonsense. However, what is clear is that the 3 letters that are shared in the 7, namely Polycarp, Ephesians, Romans, are lengthened out. As I briefly alluded to earlier, with Ephesians, we go down from about 1,000 some odd words to 470. In Polycarp, we only miss out the last 2 chapters, and in Romans, we miss out a few higgledy-piggledy bits, and a very important part in Ignatius Romans 9, which I'll come back to in a second. But if it is the case that the shorter 7-letter collection, or the so-called middle recension of 7 letters, is redacted into the 3 letters at the end of the 2nd century, we must ask all those questions that we came to at the beginning. Who is removing these things, and why are they removing them? Now, the only person that I have found who's tried to answer this question in any form of effective way was Professor Alan Brent. And in a discussion I had with him over Zoom a few weeks ago, he suggested that the only way around this could be an amanuensis, that as Ignatius was writing, 1, 2, maybe 3 secretaries were writing down Ignatius's letters, and some of them were writing abbreviated versions, and some of them were writing the full, as it was dictated. Now, ignoring the fact that even under normal circumstances, this seems to be extremely rogue and a little bit just pure conjecture from my point of view, to which he also sort of admitted as well, it raises a bigger question that, according to the narrative of Ignatius, How are these people, as the seven-letter collection of Ephesians says, how are these people, these visiting parties to Ignatius, getting in to write these letters for him? It says in Romans, in both letter collections, that he's being guarded by 10 leopards, 10 really cruel, hideous soldiers. And yet they're allowing 3, 4, 5 church officials to come in at one time, write down a load of letters, and then post them off around the globe to these other churches. This just seems to me nonsense. And even if this were true, it does not account for the surgical removal of the shorter seven-letter collection down to the three-letter collection based on the grammar that we spoke about, the theologies that we spoke about, and even the attestations from other scholars, from other early church fathers of Ignatius. Why do they only seem to quote repeatedly from the three letters? Until Eusebius, in which case we get one of the seven quoted. If it therefore is impossible that the seven cannot go down to the three, it must be in the reverse order, as we see, and we have precedent for this, for example, with Marcion's Gospel and Luke, and with Marcion's Paul, and the canonical Paul. If this is the case, then what does it mean? Well, the implications for this are quite wide and quite vast, and it's one of the things that, again, I cannot believe that New Testament scholarship is overlooking so heavily. It might not seem the case, but usually Ignatius is footnoted, or at least given half a page, to justify the dating of the New Testament, particularly of Matthew and John, and many of the Pauline epistles, particularly 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and Ephesians, I believe. If this is true, however, and the shorter seven-letter collection is end of the 2nd century, we can now forget all of the justifications for dating the New Testament. This has to go out the window, because we've already seen from Marcion that that's probably the case anyway. But if Ignatius then isn't backing them, we've got a bigger problem. If Ignatius is true, however, in the seven letters of the Middle Recension, well, then we've got to go back to the drawing board and date all of Paul and all the Gospels pre-100, I think. But let's work off my assumption, and I'm delivering a paper on this at St Andrews University in August. What can we show that the three-letter collection knew of the canonical texts, if anything, and what theologies do they bear witness to that we can now affirm are early 2nd century theologies? Well, starting with the Bible and the canon, then one of the things that I find particularly striking is that in the shorter seven-letter collection there are 58 references to canonical texts, with particular focus on 1 Corinthians, Matthew, and John, and some of Romans as well. When we look at the three-letter collection, that drops to 23. Almost half, or over half, sorry, of these mentions of canonical texts are gone. Not only are they gone, they are also more vague. They are less clear. They are confused. They are, as one scholar puts it, as Barnett puts it, hazy. And that indicates to me then that this is less someone who was copying and pasting texts and just looking at them and moving them. This is someone who's trying to quote them from memory, someone who's trying to work it out from what he can remember. In the three-letter collection, then, what do we know? Well, we know that Ignatius knows 1 Corinthians. This one stays. Of that, I have no doubt. Ignatius not only quotes some of the themes, admittedly hazily, from 1 Corinthians, he is also wrapped up in some of the rhetoric and stylistic ways of Paul in 1 Corinthians, most notably deliberative rhetoric. Pardon me. Mitchell wrote a wonderful book on deliberative rhetoric in Paul, of which she outlines 4 functions of deliberative rhetoric and how it's used in 1 Corinthians, based off the works of Isocrates and Seneca and all of those great Greek and Roman thinkers. And Paul undoubtedly copies this, and Ignatius does too. He is fascinated by the ideas of thinking about the future in the present. He's fascinated about the ideas of unity and about how we can create that unity and the advantage that gives the Sumferon to the community under the bishop. And so, if this is true, that Ignatius is using deliberative rhetoric, and we already know that he has some knowledge and can quote, at least in a blurry manner, to 1 Corinthians, then we can also say that a further affirming of that knowledge is copying Paul's style. It strikes me that if Ignatius was an Eastern bishop from Syria, although I have no doubt that Syria, in Antioch, was a big city full of traders and ideas and things like that, I think it unlikely that he would have licked it off the ground if Paul had not used it first. This deliberative rhetoric and this style. But if Paul used it and Ignatius did know 1 Corinthians, then it makes complete sense that he would use it also. The implications, unfortunately, are far more negative than positive about what it means for New Testament dating and our colleagues in New Testament studies, unfortunately. If we are correct, even if the Three-Ear Collection, as I've assumed, is a later than that as well, we've already shown the Shorter Seven Collection is a later collection in the Middle Recension than the three. And so we destroy a lot of how we can judge the New Testament. As you know, as Vincent and Valiant discussed the other day, there's very little in the way of canonical quotes in the other Apostolic Fathers, 1
Yeah.
Clement, Barnabas, etc. And Ignatius is really the only one that people cling on to. And if he's gone, that's game over. And that's why he's so vital, and the Ignatian question is so important if we are going to begin to make headway in this field.
You also stated that free LC is interpolated, which involves Ignatius's letters to Polycarp 6, Ignatius Ephesians 19, and Ignatius to Romans. How severely interpolated are these letters?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that shocked me, and I was not prepared for this at all. I thought that at the very least I would accept Cureton's conclusion that the Thriller collection was genuine as it was, and that would be the end of the story. And after I finished my PhD, I could go on and work on something else, some other New Testament text or early Church Father text. But it now is dawning on me that this will not be the case, primarily because the Thriller collection shows such a sign of, as you said, interpolation. There are 3 chapters in the Thriller collection I think have to be looked at in more detail and would need perhaps separate monographs, or at least not necessarily monographs, but at least papers written upon them. The first is Ignatius Polycarp, chapter 6 in the Thriller collection. I mentioned earlier that the threefold hierarchy of the diaconoi, the presbyteroi, and the episcopoi are missing from the three-letter collection predominantly, but they are mentioned in one place, and that is in Polycarp 6. And this is really confusing because in every other section where we find them in the 7-letter collection, they have been removed. So again, I ask those who are proponents of the 7-letter collection, if they're removing them, right, this redactor at the end of the 2nd century is removing these things, why would you not remove them from Polycarp 6? And this is something that they then immediately throw back to me and say, well, why have they included them here and not anywhere else? And my answer to that is because I think that, again, there are no such thing as letter collections. And in the case of Polycarp and Romans, we find these on their own. We have lots of manuscript evidence for Romans and only one occasion for Polycarp of this text being transmitted separately. And it's my belief that at some point or another, Ignatius to Polycarp 6 is interpolated by someone who believes in this this threefold hierarchy and adds it in. And there is not just the terminology differences in chapter 6 of Polycarp. There are other things as well. For example, the address C of the letter changes. So chapters 1 through 5, Ignatius is talking to his friend Polycarp, saying, like I said, please exhort all of those in the faith so that they may be saved. Please protect unity above all else. Be as wise wise as a snake and as loving as a dove, or something along those lines. But then in chapter 6, he changes it and he addresses the people of Smyrna. And Shodell, in 1985, in his commentary on Ignatius, who is a proponent of the 7 letters in the Middle Recension, even he admits that this is a completely enigmatic style, that there is no other precedent for this in such an epistle, that you would get this completely singular focused uh, um, list of instructions, and then at a turn of a dime, boom, straight to the Smideans. And I think that this also shows quite drastically the problem with chapter 6. In addition, the third point to why I think that's probably interpolated, the terminology, the addressee, but also I've noticed many things wrong with the lexicon and the syntax. That also changes. And those 3 things combined just strikes me that Polycarp 6 has got to have a problem with it. It would be interesting, and again, from one of my colleagues to work out, if he can find any other similar text to Ignatius 6, Ignatius Polycarp 6, and see where it come from. The next one is Ignatius the Ephesians 19. This is the only one of the 3 in the 3-letter collection that we don't have a single transmission history for. We have no manuscript that ever has Ephesians on its own. We only have it as part of every letter collection. And in Ignatius 19, Ephesians 19, we get this unbelievable star hymn. And in this hymn, it talks about the 3 mysteries that were hidden from the ruler of this world. Now, the 3 mysteries differ from the 7-letter collection and the 3-letter collection, but they basically say that from the ruler of this world there was hidden the virginity of the Virgin Mary and the birth of our Lord. And then I believe that in the 7-letter collection it also adds the death of our Lord as well. This star hymn is extremely Gnostic in the way that it is written. It is very ethereal. It is very almost it's very sort of out there, and it talks about the star of heaven. And some people have tried to link it to Matthew, but I think that's a bit out there. And again, this is the sort of hymn that would need a lot more work doing on it than I have time for in my thesis, to look at it amongst other Gnostic literature and other canonical literature to see if it does fit anywhere. But what is abundantly clear, and I'm not the first person to recognize this, it does not fit in the 3-letter collection or the 7-letter collection for that matter. Deichgraber noticed that of the some 100 words in the chapter, almost a third of them are not present anywhere else in the Ignatian literature. And that strikes me as extremely strange, that all of a sudden he would burst into this crazy sort of ethereal hymn halfway through what is ostensibly a quite a normal letter up to that point. In fact, to the extent of which it rejects Docetism to quite a large extent. So therefore you'd think it'd try and be more grounded and less higher theology in that sense. And then the last and perhaps the most interesting sign of interpolation comes from Romans in the inscription. As many people know, there's great controversy around the primacy of the Roman Church and whether we have this immediate moving from the East and the setting up of Christianity in the West in Rome. And people look to 1 Clement, for example, when trying to work out this question. But I'd argue that Ignatius' letter to the Romans also shows some really interesting signs of being pro-Roman. And this is true just as much in the 7 as it is in the 3, even to the extent that the 3 actually adds in 1 more epithet or accolade for the Romans. And so I'll just read them to you quickly, and you can see that the praise is extremely high. It says that Ignatius, who is called Theophorus, to the church which has obtained mercy through the majesty of the Most High Father and Jesus Christ, his only begotten Son, the church that is beloved and enlightened by the will according to the love of Jesus Christ. And this is where it gets really interesting. The church which presides in the place of the Romans, that's worthy of God, worthy of honor, worthy of happiness, worthy of highest praise, worthy of obtaining every desire, worthy of being deemed holy, as presides in love in the name of Jesus Christ and the Father. That presides. Alan Brent wrote a book called Ignatius of Antioch and the Second Sophistic, in which he argues that Ignatius is using terms here of the Second Sophistic and of Roman sort of thought. This word preside stands out among the Greek city-states would compete to be the home of the emperor's cult for that year, and he says that Rome clearly is the one that Ignatius seems to be pointing at here. He doesn't go as far as to say that there was a papacy springing up there at all, or even close to that. He's only drawing parallels from the Second Sophistic in Ignatius. But some scholars have ventured that far and said that this presiding in love, this is emanating. This is the place from which Christianity now emanates at the beginning of the 2nd century. And I think that this does show signs of later interpolation. I don't think, as some do, that this is just a benign praising of a church that just presides in Rome. Some have said that this is truly just about a locality. They preside in Rome and that's it. I think they preside from Rome, according to the epistle. And I think this is far too early to be considering anything to do with papal supremacy of that sort and that nature. And so I don't think that the three-letter collection is that interpolated. I don't think it's too bad to only have 3 short elements across the epistles that we need to think about. But nonetheless, the work has to be done to work out why they're there and at what point and what motive someone had for doing that interpolation.
So we have a question from Chris Bird. Thank you for the €5. Of what use is Ignatius for teaching about the Catholic faith? As one of the church fathers, if only the three-letter collection is legitimate.
Well, I think that the three-letter collection does at least attest Eucharistic theology. There is in chapter 6, is it chapter 6 of Romans? I believe it is, where Ignatius talks about the true food, which is the flesh of Christ, and the true drink, which is the blood of Jesus Christ. And this certainly lends itself to a Catholic understanding, perhaps of John 6 as well, and that sort of thing. But apart from that, we are really only left with bishops as the most senior figure in the church. That Ignatius does not get rid of. Yes, he gets rid of bishops and deacons in the three-letter collection, but he does not get rid of bishops. And these bishops are the highest of the highest order. He goes as far as to say that if you remove yourself from the bishop, you are lost. I.e., we can assume from that perhaps no salvation. I don't know. He doesn't particularly talk about any form of soteriology or salvation or anything along those lines, but he says that you're lost if you separate from the bishop through boasting, if you marry without the bishop's consent, if you do anything without him, you're toast. That's it for you. And I suppose that's one of the takeaways for Catholics that we can keep is the Eucharistic theology and the bishop side of it. And that's one of the reasons why the later scholars in the 16th century, John Calvin, for example, he rejects Ignatius. All right, he doesn't have him in the three-letter collection, but I have no doubt he'd have rejected the 3 as well. He rejects the 13. It's because he views Catholicism all over it. J.B. Lightfoot, similarly, also wants to endorse the Ignatian epistles because he's a bishop. So why wouldn't you, right? If you're a bishop in the Anglican Church, you're going to want bishops to be part of the church from the earliest time. And this has polluted a lot of the Ignatian scholarship. Everyone bringing in their prejudice and their desire to prove the text rather than assess the text for what it is. And this is something undoubtedly that I actually came into it trying to do, trying to vindicate the 7 letters, say, Marcus, I think you're wrong, stop this now. But I couldn't, with any integrity, having seen what I've seen and learnt what I've learned, get to that point. We must now, as either Christians like myself or even as secular academics, put aside our issues and say these texts have problems, and if you still want to vindicate the 7 letters, you're more than welcome to, but you've got to ask the questions that have been posed. And I'm sure that in time this will be attempted, as the debate is still so fresh, only from Marcus's book in 2019. But my fear is that scholarship may just ignore the questions and continue blindly. That is a fear that I have. As you'll know from some of the work that you've been doing, and Dr. Price
Oh yeah, yeah.
and Valiant, people just aren't really willing to engage. We've come a long way from 20, 30 years ago. Don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
But I wonder whether we wait another 20, 30 years until you and I are older men, and maybe Valiant, Price, and Vincent maybe aren't with us, and then they'll look back on those guys and say, "Yeah, holy moly, they were onto something. Is it dreadful they were ignored?"
Right.
What do you think about Richard Purvos's claim that one of the Ignatian letters appears to be quoting Ptolemy the Gnostic?
So I'm actually it's interesting you say that. So I haven't finished my PhD yet, as you've put. I am a candidate. And
Mhm.
I'm actually just about to start a chapter looking at Ptolemy and Ignatius, but I do know about Valentinus, who Ptolemy was a disciple of, and Thomas Lechner um, wrote a book called Adversus Valentinus, or Valentinius, sorry, and he argues that uh, Ignatius is aware of this sort of Gnostic theology. But again, I lay the same claim. I assume I'm going to lay the same claim actually at Purvos's door as I do at Lechner's door, which is that they only deal with the 7 letters. And I don't think this Gnostic theology is explicit in the 3 as it is in the 7. Now, don't get me wrong. I think I'm not even entirely convinced that the 7 is as Gnostic as they say. The reason why I think this is because if my theory is correct, and the 3-letter collection was written and then taken later on by a proto-Catholic, which I think is the case, why would they have written that in there? That doesn't seem to me to be something that's sensible, because not all of the theology of the 7-letter collection is either like Ptolemy or Valentinus. And if it was written by one of them, or influenced by one of them, or one of their followers, why is it included? And so I think they have to convince me slightly more. Again, after I finish this chapter, perhaps in another conversation we have, we can come back to this. But they'd have to convince me more thus far, because I don't see it. The only Gnostic element, as I said, that I can see is the star hymn in Ignatius 19, Ignatius Ephesians 19, but I don't think that's genuine. I also think that we run the risk of anachronistically applying these theologies and thoughts to Ignatius based on what we know now. I think that the question about Noetus and his influence, Marcus seemed to indicate to me the other day that he thinks it's also present in the 3-letter collection, but I think that he's not as clear that of a Noetian influence, perhaps, in the 3-letter collection, Ignatius that is. I think that, as Adolf Harnack mentions about 1 Clement, what Ignatius is not is a theologian. He is not like our later friends who are having these wider discussions. I think that Ignatius's Christology, his thoughts on canon or the Jews or any of these thoughts is both narrow and shallow. He has not put any time into thinking about it. The primary emphasis of the 3-letter collection is to, in Romans, beg them not to hinder his death. In Polycarp, to help a friend out who, for whatever reason, Ignatius thinks he can lecture in a semi-patronizing way, actually. If when you read it, you might see that. It's a bit, if someone spoke to me like that, I'd assume they're looking down on me quite a bit. It doesn't strike me as that there's a lot of respect going on necessarily. And in Ephesians, there is a smaller bit of theology, but for the most part, it's mostly just thanking them for who they are and a praising of them and an encouragement to continue. I don't think that Ignatius has got to a point yet where people are having these arguments, these discussions, and that makes sense because if we're dealing from 100 to 110, these questions haven't come as along as much. Ignatius does know about false teachers, and he warns Polycarp that they are out there, but he provides us very little evidence about what they were teaching or why. And to assume one way or t'other in the 3-letter collection would be false. In the 7-letter collection, I think you're more at liberty to do that because Ignatius does go on a bit more about some of the things he does and doesn't think. But I would still yet to be convinced of Thomas Leckler's position, and I'm sure when I get to him, Purvo's position, of that Gnostic influence.
Final question. Who do you think wrote the forged Ignatian letters?
So again, let's draw our distinctions again of the letter collections. There are the 7, which has 4 extra. Then there are the 12/13 with the Mary of with another Mary who writes a correspondence with Jesus, and then there are these ones to John and to the Virgin. I have no doubt that the ones of John and to the Virgin are medieval, and I think scholars have known that for some time and have no issue with that as a problem. They were written by as someone like Professor Vincent says, someone who has no concern for chronology, writing back to figures who existed 60 years before him, maybe. As for the other 6, that aren't part of the 7, they are clearly early, or at least not as late as John, and Mary. They convey a great deal of stuff that we would expect to see in Catholic literature today. They are clearly orthodox thinkers, aware of the canon, of all the canonical books we have today. They make extensive use of them, and they use a lot of language of orthodox theologians that appear sort of 200, 300 years after Ignatius. So, fine. The 4 in question, however, the ones that truly matter in this debate, the ones that we are, barring a few scholars who the true outskirts who are trying to argue for 13, of these other 4, Magnesians, Smyrnaeans, Trallians, Philadelphians, Parvou argues that they're written by this proto-Catholic editor / interpolator. And he is not basing the original letter collection off the 3. He seems to be unaware of the 3, even in 2008. He argues that he's interpolating them based off a fictional thing that's in Parvou's head. But I do think he's onto something about who the editor might be. I think that one of the, and this stems back to the story of Ignatius, if Ignatius, the myth around him, which we haven't got into enough, I don't think, really, but maybe we can do that another time, is wrong, and that he isn't executed in Rome, and that this bit's a bit of nonsense. He's executed somewhere else, and the letter to the Romans was actually originally authored to someone else, as Parvou claims. Then Lucian, who we also didn't cover that much, takes on this figure and undermines him and satirizes him, and then eventually leads him to this place of being a cynic. He leaves Christianity and becomes a cynic. I think then someone tries to rehabilitate him post Irenaeus, and that's for certain in my mind. I cannot see it being earlier than Irenaeus. Towards the end of the 2nd century, tries to rehabilitate this semi-lost figure who Irenaeus has forgotten the name of for whatever reason, and then applies this Ignatius name to it and introduces some of the theology over the last sort of 60 years. And as you'll know, a lot has happened between 125 and let's say 175, right? That's no small amount of time in terms of progression of theology. Perhaps at that point the whole canon was formed. All the Gospels were written in that time, more than likely. And so that redactor and interpolator goes back to those Gospels in Ignatius and adds them into Ignatius. He scatters them all in. Most interestingly, of the interpolated letters is that of to the Trallians, chapter 4 and chapter 5. because that is made up of Ignatius to the Romans chapter 9 in the three-letter collection. So he's taken chapter 9 of Romans in the three-letter collection, literally stripped it out and supplemented something new in there, and then created, based off chapter 9, a new letter of the Trallians. And from that, I think he then uses it as a springboard to finish that one and then write another 3 to further his position of a proto-Catholic position. And that's why I am skeptical of Lechner and Vincent and Hubner's position about the influence of Gnosticism, because I do see a lot of proto-Catholic Orthodox theology going in there, and I can't see why, even if this was Gnostic, when we then moved to the 13-letter collection, why that Gnostic-y element wasn't removed. You see, so that's how I think. That's long and short of who I think wrote it. This later proto-Catholic author.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Jack. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I would like to have you back at some point to continue our series on Ignatius of Antioch. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.